Please welcome to the stage, Chris Eng.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. If you thought you were going to make it all the way through a security conference without hearing the words DevOps, I'm here to ruin that for you. I want to talk about application security and specifically why it takes so long to fix security flaws. Anybody who's worked in any capacity with a development organization securing a product knows that it just takes way longer than you would expect to fix issues that you find. And I want to use some data to actually dig into that. This is a research report that my company Veracode released earlier this week. It's the 10th version that we've done on this. And as far as I know, it's the largest study of application security findings anywhere. I'll tell you how much data is in it in just a moment. We partnered up with data scientists at the Scientia Institute, who, if you're not familiar with them, they're the guys that originally did the Verizon DBIR. And so, from my perspective, the most knowledgeable InfoSec data scientists there are out there, and it was great to work with them. We do this report every year, and we're in a unique position to do that because of the way that Veracode scans code. We're a SaaS-based service, so all the code that gets scanned in our platform is something that we can see. So our customers run everything through us, and then we can then mine that data and anonymize it, slice it in whatever way we want, and ask all sorts of questions about the behaviors that we're seeing, the trends that we're seeing, and so on. Our customers like to benchmark themselves against their peers. They like to understand how they're doing, and just in general understand the state of where the application security industry is going. So for this particular report, the data included 2,300 customers, 12 months of application scan data between April 1st, 2018 and March 31st, 2019. And that included over 85,000 unique applications, many of which were scanned dozens, hundreds, even thousands of times. So I don't know anywhere else that has that much real-world data about security bugs in software. So we take that, we actually start about 6 months ago, and then there's a lot of number crunching that goes on. We ask a lot of questions about the things that we'd like to answer, and then the data scientists come back and tell us whether or not we're crazy for wanting to try and answer some of those things. So I want to start out by just acknowledging the biases in the report. This is a technical audience. This doesn't always make it in here, but I think it's important to at least acknowledge the biases. Any excuse to put this chart in, but just a reminder that correlation does not equal causation. And if I accidentally slip up and I say something results in or something is caused by, please just mentally replace that in your head with correlates with. I'm going to do my best not to do that. In any study of vulnerability data, especially code scanning data, there's a selection bias. This is, of course, data from our customers. So they choose whether they want to become our customers. They choose which applications they'd like to scan. We have type 1 and type 2 experimental errors, so false positives and false negatives in the code scanning parlance. And then I couldn't come up with a term for it, but capabilities bias, the idea that we choose what we want to scan for, we choose which languages we want to support, we choose which frameworks we want to support. And so, of course, that's going to cause some variation in the types of things we find compared to, for example, another tool vendor. Then you have the sort of like drawing conclusions biases. We don't have all the information that we would like to have about a given application, so we don't know what development methodology they were using. We don't know how old the application is. We don't necessarily know how critical it is to the business. We ask for some of that data, but we don't always get it because it's optional. So we end up aggregating a lot of that data together, and so you see a lot of averages or medians, and simply that's the best that we can do with the data that we have. And then finally, there's a tendency to look at data and you're looking at the what, but you really want to answer the why. And so sometimes we draw our own conclusions in our head about why things happen a certain way. Things take a long time to fix because developers don't care, or that's one of my least favorite things to hear. When in reality, it's probably there's just not enough budget for it, or there's a release deadline, or things that we just can't see by looking at the data. Okay, so let's get into it. Those are the biases. Keep those in mind. So this is a 50-some-odd page report. And really what I want to focus on here is fixed behavior. And I want to tie that into what we can observe about DevOps. The security community in general has had kind of a mixed reaction to DevOps. Some people hate it because it moves so quickly, and therefore security can't insert itself at all the traditional places that it always has. And so we want to understand, for companies that are doing DevOps, how does that actually affect fixed behavior? Is it positive? Is it negative? Are there things that we can look for, or different ways we can approach it to make DevOps and security play nicely together? So at the very highest possible level, we do find that most flaws in software that we detect are fixed eventually. And we can break this down a number of different ways. We have different severities of flaw, obviously, severity 5 being the highest, and we find that 75% of those flaws get fixed eventually. I'm going to get back into the timings in a minute. And then you have severity 4s, you have SANS 25, which is a common taxonomy. OWASP top 10, I think most people are familiar with. And then overall, you see that overall 56% of flaws do get fixed. But that doesn't give us any sense of the timing. It doesn't tell us the probability that something will get fixed. It doesn't tell us how those things are being prioritized and why something gets fixed and this other thing does not. And so we employ a technique called survival analysis to give us a little bit more richness in the data. And survival analysis is a statistical technique often used in medical studies, manufacturing studies. And essentially what it does is it takes into account events that happen as well as events that don't happen. So closing a flaw or not closing a flaw. I'll give you a kind of a tactical or tangible example. So imagine you're tracking 10 security bugs in an application, and then after the first week, you close 2 of those. So your average close time for a flaw is a week, right? Now fast forward 6 months later, you've still only fixed 2 of those flaws. Your average fix time for a flaw is still a week. So you're not getting the full picture, right? You're not getting information about those other 8, how long they're lingering out there, and what's the likelihood that they're actually going to get fixed. So when we apply the survival analysis technique, we get this cool picture that we're calling the flaw persistence curve or flaw survival curve. And what it shows you on the vertical axis is what's the probability that a particular flaw, a particular finding is still going to be open after a certain amount of time. And so there's a number of points on that chart that have some significance, but the one that I care about the most really is the closed median. So what's the 50% mark? 50% of closed findings were remediated in the first 2 months. And so a number of the charts that we're going to look at in subsequent slides are going to be around the median time to remediate. There's an average, there's event medians, but the one I think is most meaningful in this context is the median fix time. So when we do this survival analysis, and then we can kind of slice the data in a number of different other axes, we can do things like this. We can say, all right, break it down by flaw category and show me what the range of fix time is across each of these different categories. And so the dots on the chart represent the 25%, 50%, and 75% close mark. So, for example, if I look at authentication issues at the top there, which is the fastest time to fix, I can see that the 25% are closed after a few days. You get to that median point after, it's just under 30 days. And then there's a kind of a long tail before you get to the 75% close mark. And remember, not everything is closed, so there's not a 100% mark on any of these. And the most interesting thing about this, other than just sort of like visually depicting which flaw categories get the most attention, really, is that the high-profile issues that a security team or a security practitioner would typically prioritize are not necessarily the fastest ones to get fixed. So you look way down on the list, you've got SQL injection, with the long tail sticking way out there at 240 some odd days. That's very long for something that is so often associated with breaches and data loss. Cross-site scripting, another one that just about any security team is going to put pressure on their web development team to fix, is also very slow on the list compared to some of these other things that we might not consider to be as important. One thing we started doing in the previous volume of this report, and we continue doing this time, is we just did these same charts, 25, 50, 75% survival charts, on just different factors that we could measure, just to try and figure out, is there a certain factor that outweighs all the rest? And we would think that flaw severity, like how critical that flaw is, how dangerous that flaw is, would have a strong correlation to fixed time. And it turns out that it really doesn't. I mean, they do slightly move from left to right there, right? You do have longer fixed times for the lows, but look at the long tail for highs. Even a very high critical severity flaw, you're looking at almost 150 days to hit that 75% mark. So the theory that flaw severity would contribute really heavily to fixed time just didn't play out. We repeated this analysis with other metrics such as exploitability, which is an estimation, honestly, based on our analysis, and then business criticality of the app based on the metadata that the customer gives us. And we saw similar lack of correlation. We just didn't see anywhere where like a very highly business critical application just had fixes done really quickly. Nothing really made sense. And we can visualize, again, the different categories in terms of their urgency in a different way here. So on the horizontal axis, I'm showing the fix rate. It starts at 40% here on the left, by the way, and it goes up to 100%. So this says what percentage of those category of flaws eventually get fixed. And then on the vertical axis kind of shows you the amount of time to get to that median time to remediation that I talked about before. And so when you map them like this, and then you kind of put these labels, you divide the chart into quadrants, you can kind of see what's getting targeted. So targeted meaning it's getting fixed quickly, but not all of it's getting fixed. You're kind of picking and choosing which ones. As opposed to prioritized, it's being done quickly, and it's being done to a high degree of completion. And then everything above it, like the further you go up the chart, the longer things take. And over here on the far right, upper right corner, are the things that are just deferred. Like they do get fixed eventually, and they get fixed, almost to completion. And then over here, you have the things that just take forever, and they're not covered very well. So it's an interesting way to look at it. And again, you don't find the categories that you would expect to pop into the prioritized section showing up down there at all. In fact, there's not a whole lot down there to begin with, right? Most of the stuff is kind of in the neglected or targeted area. So that was kind of interesting. And we introduced the concept of security debt in this report, and it's something that we, I think, all use anecdotally from time to time, but essentially we like to think about it like financial debt, right? If you have a credit card and you charge something on it, and then you only pay the minimum balance every month, you're going to continue to accumulate more and more debt, and it's going to be harder and harder for you to get out from under that. Well, the same thing applies to security flaws. We looked at, in volume 1 of our report compared to volume 10, the average fixed time for a flaw, and we can see that it actually tripled from 59 days to 171 days. However, the median in the current report is still 59 days. The reason it's increased like that, the reason the average is increased like that, is because of security debt. These are all the flaws that I find out about and then I defer. And so by the time I actually do close them, the average close time ends up being really long. Now, the 59-day median, I think, is the more accurate number in terms of understanding, like, how long, does it take for a particular flaw to get fixed. So the average time just kind of depicts everything that we're accruing interest on and actually not paying down. This, using the same type of analysis, shows you what's the chance that a flaw gets fixed over time. And this was really interesting, because what it says is that recency plays a bigger factor than just about anything else in terms of whether something gets fixed. So you've got a 21% chance that something gets fixed in the first month, and then barely any chance the longer you go. It tells us that developers are kind of using like a last-in, first-out method, as opposed to prioritizing based on severity or by category or any of the other factors that a security professional might expect them to do. The strongest factor in whether something got fixed quickly was if it was just in front of the developer at that time, regardless of severity, regardless of anything. So that was something that we found for the first time in this report. And I should, I meant to apologize proactively that if any of you are, 1980s era PC gamers, this may bring back some PTSD around the CGA color palette. I did not choose the colors for these graphs, but they are all blue and pink. Okay, so this takes every application in the study, and it shows which applications are accruing debt and which ones are closing down their debt. And so everything above the line, they fixed more findings than were found. They're chipping away at their debt. Everything below the line, those applications were continuing to detect more and more flaws that they were not fixing. They were fixing fewer than they found, and so they were accumulating more debt over time. This is the same data, but visualized slightly differently, and it kind of shows you the ratio at which those applications were fixing versus finding. And you see on the bottom, those are the bad ones, right? 49% of applications were continuing over time to find more bugs than they fixed. And so they're just digging themselves deeper and deeper and deeper into a hole with no real good way of getting out there. This is the very common security iceberg graph, except what it's showing now is what's getting closed every week for an average application versus what's either continuing to be found or already known about. And so everything in pink is the debt. That's what you're trying to close, right? And in an ideal world, you'd see that pink shape as kind of a triangle. It would start large, or maybe not start large, but it would start with some debt, and you'd slowly chip away at it until you had no pink, right? It would work its way up that way. And we can see on average, it's actually getting slightly bigger. Now, we want to slice this a few different ways. This is only in here because this is a Microsoft conference, but you can see for a .NET application, the security debt looks like that, whereas for like a C++ or PHP, there's a lot more accumulation. Now, this is not to say, like, take your C++ apps and port them all to .NET. What this is really showing is that some applications or some languages may be more or less prone to the buildup of security debt based on the language that they're written in. Again, we can only see what's happening. We don't exactly know why. And so finally, how does DevOps affect this fixed behavior? Now that we have the notion of the survival curve, we have the notion of security debt, we can measure all those and we can visualize them in ways that are very easy to understand. How can we measure the impact that DevOps has? So, quick definition. DevOps is a number of things. It's a way of incorporating automation. It's changes to process. It's changes to culture. I can't really measure culture and processes from my vantage point with the data, but I can look at automation to some degree. And so, even though DevOps is a number of things, we're going to focus in on the automation component here, as measured through scan frequency and scan cadence. And so my theory is that something that's scanned every day, or more often than every day, is probably being done through automation. Hopefully, there's not a person sitting there uploading something through a browser and pressing a button every time to make that happen. Maybe the case, but I feel strong enough in the assumption that that's probably automation. And I can also tell at an overall level that 2/3 of the scans that are being conducted today or over this data set are being done through automation. So it's definitely on the rise. So when I break this down, 260 plus, by the way, corresponds to business days, so in a year. So that's basically the everyday. So we see 0.3% of applications are being scanned every day. And then if you draw a line at like the 53 to 130 mark, that's like the weekly scanning, right? So weekly and better. So if you add up those percentages from the weekly point to the right, you see that about 5% of applications are scanning at that frequency. And so maybe they're using DevOps, or maybe they're doing just Agile with a lot of automation, or they just have a really robust security process. But we're just going to assume that the more frequent the scanning is, the more likely it is to be DevOps. Okay, so how do we take that now and look at fix rates? I showed you the median fix times overall before, and I showed you by category and by severity, and here's by scan frequency. And we can see that if you're scanning daily, your median time to remediation is 3 times faster than if you're scanning once a year or up to monthly. So that's a pretty nice, significant correlation. We can also look at how scan frequency affects security debt. And so if you are scanning daily, 300 plus annual scans, you see you still do accrue a security debt. You don't accrue as much. You see it gets better and better as you get higher in your scan frequency. But it's clearly not a silver bullet, right? It doesn't make it go away. None of these things make it go away, but you don't accumulate nearly as much. This is my favorite chart, actually. This shows scan cadence. I thought this was really neat. What we want to do is we wanted to say, if you scan on a steady basis versus an irregular or a bursty basis, how does that affect your fix times? And so we plotted this out, or we calculated this for every single one of the 85,000 applications. And what we did is we calculated something called the Fano factor. The Fano factor is a ratio between the variance of the time between scans and the average time between scans. So if you're at the top there and you're steady scanning exactly on a frequency, your Fano score is going to be very low. And if you're down there at the bottom where you have a flurry of activity and then you have like nothing for 8 months and then a flurry of activity, your variance, your Fano factor is going to be very high because your variance is high compared to your average. And so when you calculate that for each of the 85,000 apps, you can then programmatically group them into steady, irregular, and bursty, depending on where you set those, where you set those thresholds. Irregular turns out to just be bursty, but more often. In looking at it, right, you can see that irregular still you have like activity followed by nothing, activity followed by nothing. Your stretches of nothing are just shorter, and so those two are kind of related. Okay, so we said, how does scan cadence affect security debt? And this is what we found there. So again, I don't remember exactly what the coefficient breakdowns we used to differentiate steady from irregular from bursty, but you get the picture here. Again, with steady scanning, you do see an accumulation of debt, but you actually do see it get reduced quite a bit there towards the end, at least on the applications in our data set. Irregular, it decreases, right? There was some burstiness. We think that irregular scanning is probably teams doing security sprints. So they accumulate a lot of debt, they accumulate a lot of stuff that people tend to ignore, and then at some point someone says, man, we got to get our head, got to wrap our heads around these security findings. Somebody's going to come audit us or whatever. And they say, let's dedicate a sprint or 2 sprints or whatever to fixing down, fixing the security debt. And so they do that, and then at the end of the sprint, they just stop doing security stuff until that happens again. And so you can see that has a positive effect in general, but it still is going to take a while to actually eliminate that debt. The one that's really clear here is that the bursty scanning does not appear to be very good in terms of reducing security debt. It grows at a rate that is just unsustainable, right? If you go 6 months or 8 months or a year without doing any scanning or fixing, it's probably not too hard to understand why your security debt would increase like that. You're adding new functionality, that new functionality has bugs, and you're just not doing anything about it. So again, steady scanning, not a silver bullet, but does appear to shape the security debt chart in the direction that we would like. So there's a lot more data in this report. We break it down by language, we break it down by industry. There's different flaw categories. We slice the data in all sorts of different ways and provide a number of graphs. I urge you to go download and read the report if you're interested in some of that. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I really wanted to focus in on the DevOps aspect of it. And here's what we think we've learned. That security automation, in this case measured by scan frequency, continues to significantly lag the widespread adoption of DevOps. You talk to any company out there, they're doing DevOps to some degree. They may not be doing it across all their apps, but they're doing it somewhere, whether it's in little pockets or whether it's more institutional. But the number of apps that are being scanned more than weekly was 5%. So we think that's really lagging. Security really needs to catch up in that aspect and embrace the automation in the way that they are with the other development tools. We find that developers don't prioritize the same way that a security person would. They don't prioritize by severity or by category or by business criticality of the application. The recency of the flaw, like how long it's been since they've seen it, whether it's just in front of them, seems to affect their fixed behavior more than any other factor that we tried to isolate. We think that incorporating the daily application testing or more is good because it showed that that those customers were able to improve their median time to remediation by 3 times. So that seems like a good correlation that we should continue to track. And then the steady testing, the steady, irregular, bursty breakdown, that does seem to facilitate chipping away at the security debt in a way that the others did not. Certainly, the bursty testing seems to be not the way to go. I think we all know that, and anybody who was asked for that opinion, if you went back to work, you would probably say that going 8 or 9 months without any security activity would be a bad idea. But now there's some data to kind of back it up, and there's some pretty charts, and hopefully this will kind of give some people some ammunition to go back and say, look, here's this large-scale study, and here are some behaviors that we think could actually lead to better outcomes. And so that's it. That's all I have. Thank you very much.